everybody. I would like to welcome you all. Be quiet. Thank you. So my name is Molly Rose. I am the operations manager here at Soldiers Memorial, and I would like to thank you all for coming today. This is a really special program we're having today. But before we get there, I would like to give a special thanks to the people who make these events possible. I would like to say a special thanks to the Missouri Historical Society members, the Soldiers Memorial Giving Circle, and our dedicated team of volunteers, some of which are in the audience here today. So a very special thank you to all of you. If it wasn't for you, these events would not be possible. Yes, thank you. Part of our commitment to our visitors is to not only teach them about past events, but to help them understand how the past has shaped the world we live in now and the world we leave to the next generation. This program encapsulates that commitment perfectly. Dr. Krister Knapp is a professor in the Department of History and a faculty research fellow in the Weidenbaum Center for Government, Economics, and Public Policy at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches courses in U.S. national security and foreign relations. He is also the coordinator of the lecture series, Crisis and Conflict in Historical Perspectives. We would like to welcome him today for this important event. Welcome, Dr. Krister Knapp.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so nice to see you all on this beautiful St. Louis day. I'm sorry we're here to talk about such a depressing topic, but I'm very glad that you're here. I'd like to thank Molly and Jose for making this event happen, and of course, Mark Sunlove. I'm very happy to be here at the Soldiers Memorial in this very important building for this historic event and for the Missouri Historical Society. But mostly I'm grateful that you came out. I am looking forward to speaking with you today about the U.S. war in Iran and taking your questions at the end. I understand we have about an hour's program, but I'm happy to keep going beyond that, either up here and answering your questions or more informally afterwards. I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then I'll take your questions. It's my understanding that Molly has a mic that will go around, and so before you ask your question, she'll give you the mic. So the war in Iran is raising numerous questions, such as why did the U.S. and Israel attack Iran, and why now? What are the stakes involved, and where is this war headed? I'm going to try to answer some of those questions by examining the given justifications for going to war, by providing some historical context of U.S.-Iranian relations and U.S. policy toward Iran, and by positing potential outcomes to and consequences of the war. At the end of the talk, I will raise some strategic dilemmas that the war poses to all the belligerents and the implications that the war has for regional stability and U.S. foreign policy going forward. So let's begin with the justification for the war. So as you all know, 7 weeks ago, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel commenced joint major combat operations. These were known as Operations Epic Fury and Lion's Roar. The strategic goal was to reduce Iran's ability to be a threat to the United States, Israel, and the greater Middle East. Toward that end, President Trump posited 4 tactical objectives in his 8-minute pre-recorded speech posted on Truth Social. Those objectives were the following. Number 1, to terminate Iran's remaining nuclear capabilities. 2, destroy its ballistic missiles, launchers, and production capacity. 3, annihilate its Navy and Air Force. And 4, reduce its material support for proxy groups in the region, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Trump also beckoned the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow their government, declaring that this would, and I quote, probably be your only chance for generations, end quote. His call for what amounted to regime change added a second strategic goal that was not necessary to degrade Iran, but more difficult to achieve than the military objective, thereby complicating the reasons for why the United States was at war with Iran. Trump has since backed off from this latter objective. Still, it is now clear that the United States is in a third Gulf War in as many decades. For a president who declared in 2024 that he would not start new wars but end existing ones, and who has relentlessly pursued the Nobel Peace Prize, this was a startling development that sent shockwaves throughout the US, the Middle East, and the world. And the ramifications of this war are just now coming into view. Now, the president's decision to go to war is quite puzzling at first glance, since it appears to be in direct opposition to official US assessment of Iran's threat level. After all, the United States national security strategy states the following: Iran has been greatly weakened by Israeli actions since October 7th, 2023, and President Trump's June 2025 Operation Midnight Hammer, which significantly degraded Iran's nuclear program. End quote. That is our official take on Iran in our official security documents. Trump also declared in the 2026 State of the Union address that the United States had, quote, obliterated the nuclear program. If Iran's nuclear and conventional military capabilities are so weak, then Iran did not seem to pose an imminent threat to the United States, as the president said it did. And so the question is, why now? Well, let's look at the immediate reasons for war then. General David Petraeus, the architect of the surge in Iraq, in the US war in Iraq during the mid-2000s, has provided three main reasons. First is what we might call missile math. You might think of this war as two archers with a number of arrows in their quiver, and whoever winds up with the most arrows in their quiver at the end wins. And so during the 12-day war in June 2025, when Israel attacked Iran, and the US pummeled Iran's nuclear sites while Iran fired hundreds of missiles at Israel, the US and Israel were forced to respond with thousands of interceptors. These anti-missiles kept Israeli and US interests mostly safe, but also depleted existing stockpiles, while Iran retained thousands of missiles in reserve for future use. Since then, the US and Israel has tried to replenish their stocks, but Iran has also reconstituted its missiles and was readying its forces to attack Israel again. It calculated that the US and Israel lacked the necessary number of interceptors to match its pace, thereby threatening to overwhelm their defensive systems. And so, as such, the US and Israel recognized they would have to attack first in what Trump called a preeminent attack to destroy Iran's capabilities before Iran could cause too much harm. And so, missile math forced the necessity of attacking Iran. A second immediate reason for going to war would be failed diplomacy. Trump's frustration with Iran finally reached a boiling point. After a year of conducting negotiations to seek a deal that would curtail Iran's nuclear program, missiles, and support for proxies, Trump concluded the regime was using the process to stall in order to build up its military capacity. It was buying time. And so he decided that further diplomacy was pointless. The process had reached the end of the line by late February, leaving only the military option. We're going to talk a lot more about the negotiations and diplomacy in a minute. And then third was a bit of good fortune. It had to do with intelligence. A perfect pattern of life in intel speak revealed the exact location of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and 40 top officials, giving the US and Israel a unique but brief moment in time to act to decapitate regime leaders. In other words, opportunity knocked. And this reminds us of William Shakespeare's lines, regarding of what Brutus, Julius Caesar's assassin, might have said to his partner Cassius at the Battle of Philippi during the Liberators' War way back in 43-42 BCE. Here's the famous quote from Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune." Indeed, Trump's ultimate justification for war was the need to seize the day, so that Iran would never be able to threaten the U.S. again. Thus, military necessity, failed diplomacy, and opportunity provided the underlying reasons for why we went to war when we did. I want to talk a little bit about the origins, because in order to understand what's going on today and where the war might be headed, we have to look at where we've been. So let's first look at the origins and the history of U.S.-Iranian relations. So the U.S. has had a very long and tumultuous relationship with Iran, as you all know, going way back to 1979, when the Iranian Revolution brought the current theocratic regime to power. The takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and subsequent hostage crisis that held 52 Americans for 44 days until 1981 severed relations, turning once allies in the Cold War into adversaries. And it created a twilight war, not quite a hot war, but more than a Cold War. This war witnessed many destabilizing events, a few of which were the Iranian-supported terrorist attacks on U.S. Marines, the Marine barracks, and the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon in 1983 and 1984. Those attacks killed hundreds of Americans. There was the Iran-Contra affair in 1987 when the Reagan administration secretly and illegally tried to sell weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages that Hezbollah's splinter group was holding, and it was believed that Iran would have some influence there. The naval battles that occurred during the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, in which Iran used sea mines to obstruct U.S.-escorted oil tankers sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, that struck and almost sunk the USS Samuel B. Roberts in 1988. The USS Vincennes was also hit. And the expansion of sanctions against Iran in 1995 during the Clinton administration placed a complete oil and trade embargo on Iran, sending Iran's economy into a tailspin. By the end of the 20th century, U.S.-Iranian relations were ice cold. Some say the two were enemies. But for the past 25 years, there has been one issue that has dominated U.S.-Iranian relations, and that, of course, is the nuclear issue. And that occurred after Western intelligence services revealed that Iran was enriching uranium as early as 2002. This discovery raised alarm bells because while this uranium could be used for peaceful purposes, such as nuclear power for electricity and research of medical isotopes if kept at low-level enrichment, the so-called 3.5% peaceful level. On the other hand, this enriched uranium could also be used to make a nuclear weapon if it was enriched to military grade level, or about 90%. And that, of course, raises the $64,000 question. Just what were Iran's intentions in enriching uranium? For peaceful purposes or something more nefarious? At that point, the new U.S. policy emerged, namely to prevent Iran from enriching uranium so that it could prevent Iran from making nuclear weapons and thus becoming an existential threat to the United States. But how is that to be done? With carrots or sticks? Hard or soft power? Economic pressure or military action? Or some combination of them? More importantly was this question. Would Iran be allowed to possess some enriched uranium so long as it was for peaceful purposes, which, after all, is allowable under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which Iran and 190 other countries are signatories? Or was any amount of enrichment too dangerous to trust Iran with? This question has vexed U.S. presidents ever since, and different administrations over the past 25 years have tried different approaches with slightly different goals. So, for example, in the mid-2000s, the George W. Bush administration tried diplomacy to convince Iran to give up its enrichment process altogether. At that point, Iran was not enriching uranium very much or to very high levels. But the Bush administration ran out of time before it could secure an agreement. The Obama administration continued this diplomatic strategy, eventually succeeding at negotiating a nuclear deal in 2015. That deal gave Iran access to billions of dollars in frozen assets in return for Iran turning over existing stockpiles of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium, and as it would also turn out, enriched plutonium, which it was reprocessing from spent plutonium rods from its nuclear energy plant. That deal suspended Iran's nuclear weapons processes for a decade or more, in some cases 15 or 20 years, depending on which part of the nuclear program you were looking at. But it also allowed Iran to enrich some uranium to 3.5% levels. The only catch to the deal was that it was time limited. Sunset clauses allowed Iran to resume their efforts at enriching uranium down the road, meaning the program had only been delayed, not solved. And so in 2018, President Trump withdrew the US from the treaty, but he had two reasons. Number one, it left Iran with some enrichment capability. And number two, it did not address Iran's other threats, namely its ballistic missiles, which it had been building up over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and its proxy forces, which it had also been building up and supporting during that time. Those proxy forces, of course, are a threat to the United States allies and US interests in the Middle East. President Trump then vowed to ensure that Iran would never get a nuclear bomb, and he inaugurated a new strategy to achieve longstanding US policy. That strategy was called maximum pressure. Even though weapons-grade uranium and a nuclear bomb are not the same thing, the two are often collapsed into the latter meaning, which is how the president talks. Still, Trump's approach was consistent with longstanding US policy to prevent Iran, even as it intensified pressure on Iran to comply. In his first term, Trump placed 1,500 new sanctions on Iran, including against its oil and gas sectors, which are Iran's economic lifeline. And it put a travel ban on Iranian citizens from entering the US. The United States also assassinated Qasem Soleimani in 2020. He was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force commander and a very important figure in the military strategy of Iran. Iran responded by attacking Saudi oil fields, to which the US met with cyber attacks against Iran. As tensions mounted, Trump continued to avow Iran would not get a nuclear bomb without getting into the details about enrichment. When President Biden came to office in 2021, he returned to engaging Iran through diplomacy. His administration tried to resurrect the nuclear deal from the Obama era, but broken trust and the fact that Biden wanted the deal to also include limits on Iran's ballistic missiles, as Trump had wanted, prevented any real significant progress. Preoccupied with other serious matters such as COVID, the rise of China, Russia's war in Ukraine, the clock ran out. When Trump returned to office in 2025, he resumed his maximum pressure campaign to force Iran to relinquish its enrichment program, as well as reduce its missiles and curtail its proxies. But the nuclear issue remained front and center, as it had for all presidents before him. And like Bush, Obama, and Biden, Trump at first tried diplomacy to convince Iran to give up its enrichment. The US and Iran had 5 rounds of talks from April to May last year, 2025, when the two sides purportedly made some progress, though the specifics of the plan were never made available to the public. However, in the middle of these talks, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, announced that Iran had amassed its largest amount ever of military-grade uranium. This unnerved both Israel and the United States, who'd been watching this slow-motion car crash. The US moved more troops to the region and began to evacuate US embassy personnel, and Israel threatened to attack Iran. The result was the 12-day war, last year in June 2025, in which Israel degraded Iran's air defense system and much of its air force, while the United States and Israel significantly damaged much of Iran's nuclear-making capabilities at 3 different military sites: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. A weakened Iran agreed to a second round of talks in February 26, where the US and Iran met 3 times and were scheduled for a 4th by the time the current war broke out. Throughout all of these talks, Iran never committed to giving up its nuclear enrichment capabilities. By February 28th, the day the US and Israel started bombing Iran, Trump's patience ran out, and we went to war. So what we can see then is, since the nuclear issue came to light a quarter of a century ago, US presidents from both parties have tried carrots and sticks to convince Iran to abandon its enrichment program, all to no avail. And yet, up until last year, all of them have managed to avoid war with Iran. And so Trump's decision to wage war is something to pay attention to, for it is at once a continuation of US policy, in that it seeks to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear state and to reduce its threat to the region and US interest there, while at the same time it marks a sharp departure, because the method used to achieve the policy goals are something we haven't done before. We have resorted to kinetic warfare to achieve our policy. And so how's it going? So I want to shift to the present and talk about war fighting, because war fighting matters. It determines the political ends that you get. And so we're at the end of the 7th week of this war, but the first 5 of it saw kinetic activity. So according to CENTCOM, Central Command in the Middle East that's running the war, the US military used coordinated air, sea, and land capabilities to conduct 13,000 strikes in Iran, as of April 6th anyway. And these were against a wide variety of Iranian military targets. This map in front of you from the respected ACLED Empirical Gathering Group, which is a nonpartisan organization, shows you where the strikes and how many strikes there have been. In the blue, you see US-Israeli strikes against Iran. In the red, you see Iranian strikes against Gulf states, and also US interests there. The black squares are US military bases or outposts in the region. But the number of circles you see are not the number of strikes. As I said, 13,000 strikes as of April 6th. Some media reports say there's been 21,000 strikes. If you look at the key on the left-hand side, you will see that as the circles get bigger, it means that there were that many strikes in that one location. So the largest circle is 56 strikes. So if you look at Tehran, you can see there have been, well, hundreds, maybe thousands of strikes alone in Tehran. And so these strikes have hit targets such as Navy, submarines, the Air Force, command and control centers, missile bases, air defense systems, communication systems, weapons bunkers, missile and drone production sites, anti-ship missile sites, IRGC headquarters and intelligence buildings. I think you get the point. It's been pretty extensive. These strikes have significantly weakened Iran's offensive and defensive military capabilities. Its Air Force and Navy have been thoroughly destroyed. Its air defense systems nearly completely destroyed. Many of Iran's missiles, missile launchers, and production sites have been destroyed, damaged, or incapacitated. Since Iran fired far fewer missiles over time of these 5 weeks, it appears that the production sites really are failing. They just don't have as many to fire off. They have to conserve them. That means that we're doing the damage that we want. It's clear then that the US strikes have significantly damaged Iran's military capabilities. In the process, a reported 1,700 civilians in Iran have been killed, and that includes 254 children. And so, whatever military bases or sites have been struck, innocent civilians have died as well, so-called collateral damage. The total cost in treasure is unknown, but the Pentagon announced that it spent over $11 billion in the first 6 days of the war. If that rate was sustained for the 5-week period of fighting, the cost will have already exceeded $50 billion. When the cost of replacing expensive interceptors and cruise missiles, other ammunition, and repairs to aircraft and naval vessels are factored in, a Harvard economist found that the actual cost will be far higher. Indeed, the Pentagon has requested from Congress an additional $200 billion for warfighting, on top of the nearly already $1 trillion annual defense budget. So the costs are mounting. Whether they are prohibitively high remains to be seen. However, the strikes have not defeated the Iranian military, nor has the government been toppled. Indeed, although its top echelon has been eliminated, the regime itself, which extends deep down into Iranian society, has survived. In fact, it has hardened its stance. It is probably now led, for all practical purposes, by the IRGC military commanders. For its part, then, Iran fired thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles and tens of thousands of drones at Israel, the Gulf states, and U.S. military bases and assets in the region. Most of those were shot down by U.S. and Israeli interceptor missiles. But as I said, you use a lot of them, you use up your stock. But some of those got through. They caused damage to airports, apartment buildings, hotels, entertainment venues, and other soft targets. A reported 22 people have been killed in Israel and 32 in Gulf states. One of those Iranian missiles landed 7 kilometers from an Israeli nuclear site. Iran's military strategy, of course, was not to try to match the United States and Israel's forces pound for pound, inch for inch. It understood it could not do that. Instead, it used a different strategy, asymmetrical warfare, in order to force its opponents to use up precious and hard-to-replace interceptor missiles while raising the pain economically on the United States, the Gulf states, and the rest of the world. As such, the war quickly turned from a military contest to an economic one, with Iran waging a war on energy, attacking Gulf state oil and liquid natural gas infrastructure, extraction sites, production, refining facilities, terminals, ports, ships, you name it. Iran has also used its geography to its advantage, choking the Strait of Hormuz by using the threat of short-range missiles, drones, and sea mines to halt maritime traffic in and out of the Gulf. Moreover, Iran retains an approximate 900 pounds of uranium hexafluoride, UF6. That's the enriched uranium in gas form, probably stored in tanks underneath those 3 mountains that we talked about. That is enough uranium to make 10 nuclear bombs. It is buried, but the Iranians could get at it after the fighting stops. Now, all of this activity has induced a global energy crisis. 20% of the world's oil and gas supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz every day. At one point, Brent crude was 42% higher than it was at the start of the war. Right before the war, oil was about $70 a barrel. But at its highest point, it had reached $120 a barrel. Investment markets were down 7% at their lowest point. Now, although the U.S. does not consume any Middle Eastern oil or natural gas, in fact, we export them now, global supplies are being limited, and that is causing pain throughout the entire system. It is true that the average price of gasoline in the United States is up over $1.10, but that is something Americans can absorb for the short run. But gasoline prices are much, much higher in Asia countries, since they consume most of the Middle Eastern energy. And that oil is just not flowing out anymore. Liquid natural gas costs for stoves and homes in Europe also spiked. But fuel pump and heating costs are not the only things being affected here. Petroleum products such as jet fuel and diesel are now in short supply, thus driving up the cost of air travel and shipping costs. Europeans have said they only have 6 weeks left of jet fuel. So if you're traveling to Europe this summer, give that some thought. This has led to inflation. The cost of shipping goods such as food and consumer items has become more expensive. A box of pasta at Schnucks costs $4 now. So the inflation rate increased to 3.3% in March. That's bearable for now. It's historical lows, but who knows where it will go. It could get worse if energy markets tank and costs increase. And then, of course, finally, there's the damage to the Gulf Strait infrastructure itself, which has been significant. The Iranian strike on Qatar's main gas field took offline 17% of its production capacity, which the Qataris estimate will take 5 years to bring back up to full capacity at a cost of $20 billion. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and the Emiratis have also suffered hits to their energy infrastructure. Indeed, Iran has struck the UAE more than it has struck Israel. Think about that. Most energy experts expect long-term effects that will delay a decrease in prices, since it will take time to resume the pre-war levels of production. So even if the war ended today, inflation and high prices will remain for some time because of the spike to the cost of oil and natural gas. Finally, Iran also hit and damaged U.S. military bases, radar detection sites, an MQ-9 Reaper drone, and 2 U.S. fighter aircraft whose pilots had to be rescued. So far, 12 reported American military personnel have been killed. Meanwhile, Israel, which is engaged in multiple wars on all of its borders, continued fighting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon as Israel and U.S. struck Iran. Israel has conducted numerous airstrikes on Lebanon's capital, Beirut, ostensibly against Hezbollah members, but which in fact have actually killed more Lebanese citizens than have been killed in Iran. And so far, a reported 2,020 people have been killed in the fighting in Lebanon, and that also includes 12 Israeli soldiers. And so where are we now after all this war fighting? Let's talk about the ceasefire and then the negotiations, because the devil's in the details. Well, on April 7th, a 2-week ceasefire went into effect in which all the belligerents agreed to halt their strikes, even as Israel continued to strike Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and targets in Beirut, though by April 16th, just 3 days ago, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a 10-day ceasefire, and all the guns fell mostly silent. Now, of course, the point of the ceasefire was to create a diplomatic opening to negotiate a peace deal, to create some space to bring this war to an end. The U.S. and Iran are seeking an end to the war because, well, the ducks have lined up. The moment is right. For the U.S., they have, at least so far, failed to achieve their objectives through military means. Iran is still standing. Iran, for its part, is taking a beating nonetheless and wants it to stop. And so both sides have an interest in negotiating a settlement. And so what might an agreement look like, and how have the negotiations gone so far? Well, if you've been following the news, you know it's been rough going. Now, the U.S. initially offered a 15-point plan whose key demands on Iran were really the following 5 core items. Number 1, roll back your nuclear program. Number 2, agree to a civilian nuclear cooperation with the U.S. Number 3, use the IAEA to monitor for monitoring of your activities, Iran's activities. Number 4, limit its missiles. And number 5, reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran did those 5 things, in return, the U.S. would provide sanctions relief. Iran rejected the U.S. plan, calling it too maximalist, and countered with its own rather maximalist 10-point plan. And their key demands could be boiled down to the 5 following items. Number 1, it demanded the U.S. and Israel stop attacking Iran and assassinating its leaders. Number 2, it wanted a reinforceable guarantee that it would not do so in the future. That is, the United States and Israel would have to agree to never attack Iran again. Number 3, that the U.S. and Israel not attack its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Number 4, it wanted war reparations. It wanted the United States to pay for all the damage it had done to Iran. And number 5, it wanted international recognition and guarantees regarding what it said was Iran's sovereign right to exercise authority over the Strait of Hormuz, as if an international body of water belonged to Iran. Now, if you're following closely, you can see there's virtually no overlap in the two plans. And the two sides, not surprisingly then, made little to no progress in reaching a deal. Both plans, of course, were more aspirational than realistic. They were opening salvos in what looks like is going to be a long process. And so they started big, and they will have to whittle down to something more realistic. However, while the two sides had not been negotiating face to face, instead they've been negotiating through the Pakistanis. When boiled down, though, the essentials were Iran's uranium enrichment and its existing stockpiles. They were the Strait of Hormuz, and they were sanctions relief for Iran. It is really those three things: Iran's nuclear power, the Strait of Hormuz, and sanctions relief. Around those three things, it might be possible to provide a framework for a deal. And so on the weekend of April 11th, 12th, Vice President J.D. Vance met with Abbas Araghchi, Iran's Speaker of the Parliament, and Iran's chief negotiator over the Obama nuclear deal. And so he knew what he was doing. This was a historic moment because it was the first time that Americans and Iranians had met face to face for formal negotiations since 1979, almost 50 years ago. You can't negotiate an agreement with your adversary or your enemy if you can't talk to him face to face. The Islamabad talks, Islamabad is the capital of Pakistan. The Islamabad talks failed to reach an agreement, as you all know, but several important developments occurred. Leaks of the negotiations revealed the outlines of a deal in the making, in which Iran would agree to open the Strait of Hormuz. It would turn over enriched uranium, and it would forgo all further enrichment at any level for 20 years in exchange for sanctions relief. Or at least that's the deal that Trump wanted. But Iran has so far not actually rejected that deal outright. Of course, it wants to amend it to its own advantage. In particular, it wants to limit the number of years that it cannot enrich uranium to just 5 years. Now, in the Obama deal, they were delayed for 10 years. Trump wants 20. The Iranians now want just 5. The Iranians had already agreed to 10 under Obama. It would appear that we may be going backward. So they would delay Iran's uranium enrichment. They would find some way to neutralize the threat posed by Iran's military-grade stockpile. And they would try to find some way to reach an accommodation of Iran's role in the strait. And if those things could be done, then in principle, the US and Iran would have a deal that could end the war. Now, betting markets, and if you don't know, there are markets out there you can bet on pretty much everything. Betting markets think that the deal will come by April 30th, just 10 days away. And that near full energy capacity in the Gulf will resume by June 30th this summer. However, as of right now, both the US and Iran have imposed their own blockade on the strait. The US to prevent Iranian ships filled with oil and liquid natural gas from exiting the Gulf to reach China, which buys 90% of Iran's oil. Iran to prevent Gulf state ships filled with oil and liquid natural gas from Arab states from reaching world markets, especially in Asia, Africa, and Europe. No one can get ships in or out. There's a double blockade. And so both are preventing ships from entering or exiting the Gulf. As of yesterday, the US blockade has succeeded in peacefully forcing 24 ships to turn around, including Iranian oil tankers, which means Iran cannot sell its oil to China. Iran, as of the other day, fired on 2 Indian-flagged vessels, a cargo ship and an oil tanker traversing the strait. Trump responded this very morning that he would resume negotiations in Pakistan, And Vice President Vance and the team are once again said to be headed to Islamabad. If the Iranians did not accept his offer, he said, the U.S. would bomb Iranian bridges and electrical facilities. It would appear then that the ceasefire, which is due to expire in 3 days, is very fragile, and that the control of the strait remains highly contested. And so far, the two sides have yet to reach a deal on Iran's enrichment program and existing stockpiles of weapons-grade uranium. Now, maybe betting markets know something I do not, but it appears to me that we are nowhere near a deal and that more fighting is likely on the horizon as both sides compete for control of the strait while they continue to negotiate over the nuclear issue. And so that leaves us with where this is all going. Let's talk about the future. As you all know, fortunately, all wars come to an end at some point. But this one might not have a clear ending in which all the shooting is halted, that permanent agreements are reached and adhered to over time, and that the belligerents return to their more pressing domestic matters. Instead, it is possible for this war to drag on in different form, at less intense levels, with occasional kinetic flare-ups, and without any substantial agreement going forward, a kind of gray zone of uncertainty. After all, since the Iranian regime has survived intact, retains military firepower, has degraded but extant proxies in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon and Gaza, and now recognizes that it can impact the flow of maritime shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, it's not going to go back to the status quo ante. There's no going back to the way things were before. The genie's out of the bottle. So despite the beating that Iran has taken, the regime is emboldened to rebuild its power in the region, continue impacting energy markets, and maintaining its aggressive posture toward Israel and U.S. military bases in the Middle East. Its allies of Russia and China remain supportive, and they have helped Iran during the war with electronic and intelligence capabilities that allowed Iran to strike U.S. military bases and radar stations. Russia has benefited as well after the U.S. lifted sanctions against Russian oil, thereby providing Putin with an additional $1.5 million per day to wage war against Ukraine. China has such large oil reserves that market prices have yet to seriously impact its economy. The new reality then will not be a cowed Iran willing to bend the knee to U.S. and Israeli bidding, but a wounded, angry, and empowered Iran that is seeking long-term standing revisionist goals, namely trying to kick the United States out of the Middle East, trying to push Israel into the Mediterranean, in order to do what? In order to counter the Sunni Saudis and Turks in a massive bid at dominating the Middle East. That is, it appears the Iranians are not going away anytime soon. Now, it's too soon for final evaluation, but at this point, Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion have failed to achieve their strategic goal, even as the militaries achieved the tactical ones in what has been a very impressive war from the U.S. and Israeli point of view. Service personnel have performed admirably well, and we should thank them for this. But in the bigger picture, overall, the campaign has failed to convert military might into political gain. And since war is politics by other means, as the Prussian military strategist von Clausewitz has long taught us, it will be hard to see this as a U.S. victory at this point. Things could change, but that seems to be where we are now. And so regardless of who wins, this new dynamic in the Gulf will require not only that the U.S. remain in the Middle East, but actually ramp up its military presence to balance against Iran's newfound deterrence capabilities. This will mean continuing to allocate resources to the region and likely increase defense budgets at home. And this is extremely ironic because the U.S. has been trying to reduce its footprint in the Middle East and pivot to Asia for great power competition with China since 2009. And Trump's national security statement has said that the Middle East was no longer a place of conflict, but set to become the next place of economic growth. Instead, what the war has given us is a region full of security challenges and uncertainty. Indeed, this is the worst possible outcome for the Gulf states in particular. Until the war, the Gulf states had created modern cities such as Dubai and Abu Dhabi as reliable hubs for business and high tech and tourism. They've sold themselves as places for investment. These efforts have boosted their coffers, their regional stature and reputations, and as something more than just petrol states, as fuel for the world. It has also helped them protect their power. But the war has shattered that status, and it will take much time and money to rebuild it, if in fact it can be restored. Gulf state leaders are already looking to reestablish détente with Iran and find bilateral agreements to prevent further attacks on them. They will look for other ways to move their oil and gas out of the Persian Gulf, probably through pipelines to other exit points from the Middle East. Gulf leaders will likely rethink their security strategy of relying on the U.S. defensive shield, since U.S. military bases became targets that made them vulnerable instead of shields that protected them. And Gulf leaders will likely consider building up their own defensive and perhaps even offensive military capabilities as well, which will make the region more dangerous, not less. And so the war has raised many thorny questions about Gulf modernization strategy. And then finally, there is Israel. Israel will settle for a degraded Iran, a bird in the hand. Iran is less of a threat than it was beforehand, but only for a while, right? Because the regime remains intact, and Israel understands that. Israel understands that it has only delayed future threats, not prevented them for all time. And thus it knows that it will likely be back at war with Iran at some point in the future. I'm not a gambling person, but if I was, it would be pretty soon. If there is a lesson in all of this, and I don't know if there is, but if there is a lesson in all of this, it might be the following. Vets in the room will understand this. Limited war usually yields limited results. Limited war yields limited results. Total war can yield victory. Well, we've not had total war, we've had limited war. We know that limited war yields limited results from the wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. None of which were won through limited fighting. In fact, none of them were won. And certainly not through air power alone. But we may not have fully absorbed the wisdom of that lesson after all these years. In that sense, Iran will likely go on being a situation to manage rather than a problem to be solved. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take any questions. Molly will have a mic.
You had mentioned the pipelines. I had read something from the Hudson Institute about the effect of those pipelines to go around the Strait of Hormuz. And furthermore, that the price of gas that we're experiencing now is really based upon the futures contracts that have been going on in the marketplace, not in reality, but the way the futures markets did that. Could you address that, please?
Sure. So one strategy moving forward might be to not ship oil and liquid natural gas out of the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, but to ship it through pipelines yet to be built, although there is a major pipeline running through Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea, and thereby avoid Iran's control of the strait. It's my understanding that you can ship about 7 million barrels through there, but it's much less than what you can actually do through ships. So more pipelines are going to have to be built. But pipelines are infrastructure, and pipelines can be targeted like anything else. So pipelines are not a panacea against future attacks. But you're right about the futures. So there's a stockpile and reserves in the system of both oil and natural gas. And so that's what we're using to keep prices from reaching sky-high proportions. But those stockpiles are going to run out soon. And so that's what you mean about the futures market. It's important to understand here a little bit about the infrastructure of oil and natural gas. So oil and natural gas don't flow like water in your house. You can't just turn it on a spigot like you can your water or whatever. Once you shut down those spigots, it's very difficult to get them back up to full capacity. It can take weeks. It can produce side effects. There are other gases that are potentially explosive that can blow up wells and so forth. It's a very complicated technical process. And so oil and gas companies are very reluctant to shut these things down if they don't have to, but that means oil has to flow. But you can see the problem. If it's not going out through the ships and the pipelines can't handle the total volume, you have what oil energy experts call a shut-in problem. And so you have to start turning things off, knowing that future supplies are going to be affected. And that's your future markets that you're talking about. So far, there's enough oil and gas in the system. We're running out. As I said, the Europeans said they have enough jet fuel for about 6 weeks. So there won't be any more raw product coming in to make jet fuel after that. So you could be looking at ground planes, or at least far fewer flights, right, would be more likely. So these are the sort of problems. So I don't think pipelines are a panacea here. So Iran maintains some leverage. Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, ma'am, right there in the, I believe, the brown.
So there are reportedly about 50,000 troops right now.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering what you think. Is that just an intimidation tactic? But it seems like more are being sent all the time.
Yeah.
Wondering what your crystal ball says about, are we preparing actually for a ground invasion, or is this just an intimidation tactic?
So I'm a historian. Any crystal ball I have is used to predict the past, which we're pretty good at. That said, there's an extremely serious part to your question. It's my understanding that when we commenced operations, we had about 50,000 airmen and sailors. It's largely a naval and air operation, although there are some special forces and other members from the other branches there. We know that 2 Marine Expeditionary Units have been sent, one from I believe, Hawaii, or it's on its way, the other one from East Asia. And that one's already there. And of course, a Marine Expedition Unit can do pretty much anything you want it to do. They're the Marines, 1, 2, 3, 4, we all love the Corps. They're first in and they're going to achieve whatever objective needs to be achieved. But it's yet to be decided on what that is. Is that to take Kark Island much further up the Gulf where 90% of Iran's oil and natural gas comes out of and is loaded onto ships? Well, what would they do after they took it? They would be sitting ducks. Is it to try to go after some of the missile batteries that are all along Iran's coastline, a 1,000-mile coastline? Imagine trying to find all the batteries up and down the East Coast from Bar Harbor, Maine to Key West, Florida. That would be a big deal. That would take a lot of, I mean, our military is great, but it would just take a lot of work. It's also my understanding that some elements, maybe up to 10,000 members of the 82nd Airborne may underway, but these are all just reports in the media, so I don't know for sure. I only know what you know and what you've read. But that is not a ground force for invasion. Definitely not, right? We moved 500,000 troops to the Gulf in 1991 in preparation for the Gulf War under General Powell, right? And so we weren't, Joint Chiefs of Staff, but General Schwarzkopf, right? And so we weren't going to go in light on that one. So there's no, I don't see any offing for any kind of land invasion here. And Trump has been very consistent over the years. He's not interested in that, right? But then that leaves you with, you know, a very capable Air Force and Navy, but you can't win wars alone with that. Anyone who's served in the Army in here will know you've got to put boots on the ground in the end of the day. And that's a huge political question at home because there was no taste for this war before it began, and it's only decreased since then. So to the best of my understanding, and I am not a military expert or strategy, but to the best of my understanding, the numbers just aren't certainly there for any kind. But that doesn't mean we couldn't do smaller, more pointed things with special forces or Marine Expeditionary Units, right? And right now we're opting for the naval blockade. It's less dangerous to our troops, it's more effective, and it might achieve our ends. And so we need to match our operational capacities with realistic goals. So right now, I don't think there's any real desire to actually want to invade Iran and overthrow the regime that way. I don't see that in the cards. We haven't prepared for it. So great question. Someone else?
Yeah, there are two things that I don't think you'd address, and I want maybe you can talk about them briefly. One is, was there really any alternative from keeping Iran getting the bomb other than a military one?
Right.
And number two, you haven't addressed the question of the Iranian, I don't know the right word, but their messianic goals
Sure.
against Israel and the United States and Western civilization.
Yeah. So let me be clear. I support the end of this regime. I think what we're debating about is, I recognize it as a threat. I don't think it should have nuclear, I definitely should not have nuclear weapons. I don't think it should even have enrichment capacity, even though it is a signature of the NPT, for the second reason that you mentioned, that there is a messianic quality to this. So I'm more of a hardliner on that. What we're talking about is the method on how we prevent Iran from doing that. So we've degraded Iran. It is less of a threat than it was. That's a good thing. But what we've done is only buy ourselves some time. We had Iran not, we had, under the Obama nuclear deal, we had them agreed to not enrich uranium for 10 years. And in some cases 15 or 20 when it came to the plutonium. And so now we don't have any of that. So what kind of deal is Trump going, if he gets a deal that stops them preventing any kind of uranium enrichment for 20 years, that's a better deal. And so attacking Iran to get that deal might in the end be worth it. But right now, he doesn't have that deal. I hope he gets it. I hope we get a permanent deal. I hope that Iran agrees to give up its ballistic missiles and stop supporting its proxies. But right now, I don't think for all of the tactical success we've had that we've created enough leverage to move Iran enough on that. And so it may be that there has to be more pain. I hate to say it. I'm not advocating war. I'm just saying in terms of the principles involved. So there may not have been any other choice. I agree with your point. The question is, has it achieved its objectives? So, excellent question. I hope I answered that. Yeah, down in front here.
Professor Knapp, once again, fantastic talk, very informative. I wanted to ask you a military tactical question, which is why CENTCOM chose to focus on a blockade within the Gulf of Hormuz as opposed to one where they were interdicting Iranian oil tankers in the Indian Ocean, far away from drones, far away from anti-ship.
I see. I may have misspoke. Our blockade is actually in the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz. So we are not actually in the Persian Gulf. So once the Iranian ships come through the strait and they try to exit through the Gulf of Oman and into the Indian Ocean, they cannot do that. Those are the ones, and we've been just by flexing our muscle, these ships have turned around. So they go back through the Gulf of Oman and into the Persian Gulf. So that's where our blockade is. The Iranian blockade is further up in the strait itself. Right. Right. Okay, so for those of you who may not have heard, why so far out? Why not further in the Gulf? Well, first of all, it's more dangerous. Well, because then the tankers have any number of directions they could go. The net would be too far away. Yeah, it's just too far away. So I think that's a happy medium for them. Again, safe enough distance, can achieve the objectives, don't need to put U.S. military personnel in harm's way any more than necessary. You know, I think that's the happy medium. Way over here, let's try some on this side of the room here.
The fact that sometimes President Trump acts erratically is affecting the way Iraq is negotiating with the United States.
So President Trump has a certain rhetorical style. But the question is that rhetorical style helping or hurting the U.S. cause in this conflict? And there are different opinions on that. Some people see it as erratic, and that he's not in control of himself, that he contradicts himself, that he doesn't know what he's doing, and thereby sort of undermines his own authority and can even walk himself into positions because anything the president says sounds like policy. So at one moment we're going to negotiate, at the next moment we're going to engage in civilizational erasure. And so it would seem that his rhetoric might be his own worst enemy. And so there is that school of thought. But there's another school of thought, which is that he's trying to scare the you-know-what out of the Iranians. That this is the so-called Nixon madman theory, that he's engaged in a hardline approach. He's taking a maximum pressure, including in rhetoric, that he wants the Iranians to think that he will really destroy electrical infrastructure if they don't get around to it, that he means business. Now, of course, you have to act at some point, otherwise you look like you're just crying wolf. But how could the Iranians doubt him at this point? Nobody thought this was going to happen. No expert that I know, right, before the war started. So the rhetoric is designed, even if he doesn't always seem to be in control of it, to match the military might. And so the difference between the two schools of thought is basically whether people support Trump or they don't. Right? Yeah, that's my understanding anyway. Yes, sir, right here next door.
How's the U.S. anti-drone inventories and anti-missiles? I understand they're burning through it. Is there any predictions on when we're going to run out?
So I don't have a security clearance, and if I did, I wouldn't share that information with you. But one of the most closely guarded secrets is how many interceptors do we have left? Now, there are other ways to shoot down drones too. There's a number of different ways, but really there isn't one optimum way yet. We're working on it. Certainly you don't want to use a multi-million-dollar interceptor to shoot down a drone. You would save that for a ballistic missile. But sometimes we have. I mean, Iran has tens of thousands of drones and can still keep making them. They're cheap and they're fast and so forth. And only one or two need to get through out of a swarm of 100 or two in any given sortie or attack. So I think part of the reason why you've seen the pause is for the United States to look at its stockpile. So one number I heard reported in the press, but I can't verify this, is that we may have used up 40% of our stockpile. That's a lot in 5 weeks. We also moved a Patriot missile battery and some other anti-air capabilities out of the Asian theater into the Middle Eastern theater. And so we have less defense capability in the East. So if we're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, then it should be a bit of a concern here, right? But that's a very closely guarded secret. So I think we just don't know. Right? Yeah. Yes, back here, sir, in the hat. Yeah.
Again, thank you for all your good information. I think most folks in this room totally unaware of the complexity of the matter. However, how do we know, or you, know how many pounds of nuclear material that are in Iran? Also, while you're answering that, how many pounds are in Israel? How many pounds are in Pakistan? And how many pounds are in India? And just to kind of like close that question out, why would a country like Iran not want to have for their own defense some type of nuclear deterrent when neighbors and when we have an aggressive posture that Israel's been taking, and if they're in possession of nuclear material or bombs, how can we expect Iran realistically to basically be a sitting duck as we've seen?
Right.
So if you'd address those, I'd appreciate it.
Excellent questions. So again, I don't have any special information or inside sources to how many kilograms or pounds that Iran has. I'm just using the same open sources that we're all reading about. And intelligence services in the West report the equivalent of about 900 pounds of weapons-grade enriched uranium that they have, enough for about 10 bombs. It's important to realize here, though, that having that enriched uranium is not the same thing as having a bomb. There's two other steps that have to occur. One is turning that hexafluoride gas into a small combustible unit And two, and this is the really hard part, being able to fit that on the tip of a missile. And that kind of nuclear physics is extremely difficult, and it's not clear to me that Iran has that capability yet. Moreover, Iran doesn't have long-range missiles, so they certainly can't hit long-distance targets such as the United States or something like that. So I'm only reporting what's been reported over and over again in the press. As for why Iran wouldn't want nuclear material as a deterrence, I think it's an excellent question. If you flip this whole thing on its head, some people feel that Israel is the revisionist state in the Middle East. That Israel has taken 900 square miles from Syria since October 7th, 2023, right? That Israel has pushed deeper into Gaza, into southern Lebanon, and that the far-wing right party in Israel is pushing for a greater Israel. And so Iran, which we in the West think of as a revisionist state that wants to reshape the Middle East to its interests, sees Israel as the revisionist state. And because Israel does have nuclear power, and I don't know how many pounds, also a closely guarded secret, right? But we know they actually have bombs and missiles. Iran sees Israel as the threat. So of course Israel would want some kind of nuclear deterrent. And there is that school of thought out there that argues Iran should have it as a counter against Israel. And then through the mutual assured destruction doctrine that we used throughout the Cold War, neither Israel nor Iran would ever attack one another again for fear of inciting a nuclear war. I'm not of that school, but there is that school of thought out there. And it gets back to the earlier gentleman's question about, can you trust this regime? Right? This is a regime that every Friday has people in the mosque chanting death to America, death to Israel. Right? I mean, I don't think they're trustable. I don't think they're responsible stakeholders in the international system. I think they've demonstrated that time and time again. And so they may be signatories to the NPT that allows them for a minimal amount of uranium enrichment. And we can debate on whether they can have that little bit or not. And that's really where the sticking point is. But the problem has been when they've gotten up to 20% and beyond. And so I just don't think it's a good idea. That's my personal opinion. But I can understand why Iran wants it, for sure, for exactly the reasons that you said. So, excellent question. Yep. Let's go over here to the gentleman in the blue shirt.
With all of the activity that the United States has been involved in over the last couple of years in Ukraine and now in the Middle East, and having suffered a substantial decline in their military hardware, would you be worried that in the near term it might be the right time for China to finally move on Taiwan?
We've definitely used up some stockpiles, as the previous question, or two questions ago, indicated. However, it's my view that China isn't going to actually militarily invade Taiwan. It's going to take Taiwan through indirect means, which it's already doing. It engages regularly in military exercises with air and sea forces and power to surround Taiwan on a regular basis. It is already moving on the outer islands that exist across the Taiwan Strait from Taiwan. But I think Xi Jinping has to be looking at Ukraine and Iran and thinking to himself, do I want that problem right on the shores of China? Is there another way we can do this? Millennia of Chinese strategic thinking is a slow strangulation process. Sun Tzu said, the best warfare is the one in which a shot is never fired. I think China is trying to take Taiwan through a very long economic strangulation process, political alienation process. And so I don't think Xi Jinping is going to look at this and say, the US is weak, now it's my chance to leap. I think he's going to look at this and say, what are the lessons I can learn so that I don't make these mistakes? But we have our own plan anyway. That said, I'm sure the Chinese PLA is taking stock of how much stuff we're using up. And so they're probably adjusting what they need in certain places too, for sure. They are also, as reported of yesterday, secretly selling weapons to Iran. And in the past, we know they have sold them 50 carrier sinkers, as they're known informally. These are anti-ship missiles that have a long-range distance with accuracy that can sink an aircraft carrier, which is another reason why you want to keep the aircraft carriers a little bit further away. Now, of course, Iran has not employed them, thankfully. That would bring great wrath down on them. But they have them, and the Americans know this. And so the Chinese have helped them for sure. So great powers often make unforced errors. Russia has made one in Ukraine. The Soviet Union made one in Afghanistan. The United States made one in Vietnam. We may, it's too soon to tell, have made one in Iran. And when great powers do that, it emboldens other great powers. And so if there are winners here, it's Russia and China so far. Yeah, so that's my answer to the Taiwan question. But I could be wrong. The United States military establishment is convinced China is going to invade Taiwan, and so are many other people. So, Other questions in the far back here from a staffer.
Thank you very much for your enlightening program. My question is about the Iran hostage crisis. We tell that story directly below here in our St. Louis in Service Gallery. I'm curious if there are impacts from those 444 days that either may have caused our entry or hastened our entrance into this conflict, or also if there were lessons from that you see that might help us move forward.
So I think that the hostage crisis was one point among many, as I kind of ticked off in my very brief adversarial relations between Iran and the United States since 1979. But it's the first one, right? It goes with the seizing of the embassy. And let's remember that the revolution was widespread in Iran in 78. It was not clear yet it was going to become a hardliner theocratic regime. There were Air Force mechanics and students and working class and people from the left and the right end of the spectrums and so forth. And so it was unclear what the future of Iran was at that point. But when Ayatollah Khomeini returned and they took over the revolution and they turned it into the state they did, and the students stored the embassy and he owned the hostage crisis, it's the first of all of those moments. And it's the first to recognize that after 25 years of the US having good relations with Iran under the Shah, right? Pahlavi, right? Which for sure there's a lot of debate about the nature of Reza Pahlavi's regime. Some see him as a despot, others see him as an enlightened dictator that was doing good things for Iran. The general story is that with the MI6 and CIA help of the Iranian military overthrowing the democratic elected Mossadegh, and that brought the Shah to power, created resentment in Iran toward the West and the United States, toward former colonial powers like Britain and to new emerging global powers like the United States at that time in mid-20th century. And so Iran developed hostilities toward the United States early on, or at least in the culture. And then we developed hostilities in the culture against Iran for holding these hostages for 44. And I think those are two founding moments that get at the underlying animosities between these two, even though we actually have a lot in common as cultures and peoples, and we want a lot of the same things. 90 million Iranians want to be part of the West. They want to participate in the global commons. They want to come to American universities. They want to be tech engineers and lead the AI revolution. They want to be part of the new world. They are just suffering under this oppressive regime that is now going to be worse. It is such a tragedy on what has happened to the Iranians. And so I have been in favor of trying for us to do something about that. In our better angels, right? And we have a lot of dark angels in our history in U.S. foreign policy, but of our better angels. But I just don't know whether this war is going to achieve that. I just don't know yet, right? It's too soon. But it's a great question about the hostages. It's certainly a pillar of where a lot of this comes from. We are way past time. I'm further to take any questions, but maybe down here in front. And yeah.
One last one.
One last one.
I just don't know if there's any chance that the protests that were going on in Iran 2 months ago thousands and thousands of people. Is there any chance that that will be resurrected? It sort of, or are they really put down completely?
I think for right now, as long as the fighting is going on and there's a great deal of uncertainty in Iranian society, you're not likely to see protesters come out on the streets. It's also important to realize there's been an internet blackout. We actually have very little understanding about what's happened in Iran in the last month and a half. There's no Western media, and there's very little capability, except for people who can occasionally get, a Starlink connection through their phone to get information out to the West. They've had rolling blackouts. A lot of these targets are military sites that are positioned in highly dense areas and urban centers, and that is how the civilians have been killed, by being in the blast radius of these bombs. So they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time through no fault of their own. Work has stopped, school has stopped, right? And so there's not really any sense of normalcy, and many Iranians don't have a real sense of what's going on in the outside world. So I don't think there's going to be any sort of impotence or momentum for protests right now. It's just not safe. But that could return. Iranians have also been told by the Bajij, the police that monitor the streets, if you come out, we'll shoot you. So people are just hiding. So it's a really bad situation for Iranians right now. But as I said, that could change when the fighting stops. But we'll have to wait and see. All right, thank you very much for coming.